dear schmucks, infidels. It is I, Osama bin Laden. No, really, it is me. And you're a filthy anti-Semite if you doubt it for a second. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah. The pot, sir. My good buddy Mahmoud Ahmadinejad just gave me a wonderful Passover. Ramadan present. It's a nuclear weapon. Kinda like the ones we have, the Israelis have at Dimona. Only they don't have them, so this is nothing like those. And you're a filthy anti-Semite if you doubt it for a second. So anyway, my good buddy Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who just loves to give me nice hugs and shoulder rubs, he gave me this bomb and he said, "Use it on the great Satan of America." And so that is what I'm going to do as a revenge for you killing me. So, remember, when you see that bright orange flash of light and hear the big bada boom, you should all think, Arabs, 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 Arabs. So, shalom. Salami, l'chaim, or whatever. I'm Osama, and you're a filthy anti-Semite if you doubt it for a second.
And here we go, folks. It is Sunday, November 13th, 2011, and you are listening to today's edition of the Ugly Truth Podcast. No, you're not imagining things, folks. 2 days in a row, Saturday and then Sunday. You're probably asking yourself, what did I do to deserve this? Either for good or for ill. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there's just a lot to discuss. And since Sundays generally are sort of a day off for me, in that I don't do any physical work, I have a little bit of free time, and so therefore you'll find that oftentimes that Sundays are program day. And so that's what you did to deserve it, folks, is that the weekend rolled around and Sunday happened to be part of it. Anyway, have a very interesting and important program lined up for you today. Have one of our regulars on the program, who I will be bringing up here in just uno momento. Want to send a thank you out there to several people, several entities. The first of which is Kourosh Ziabari, the Press TV journalist who was on the program earlier this week, talking about Iran, talking about all of this war talk from Israel and the United States. I thought it was a very interesting program. I look forward to having him back on again in the very near future. Also, our good friend Sami Ibrahim, who had been on yesterday, as a matter of fact. Another fascinating program. You never are disappointed when Sammy is on, because, as I have pointed out, Sammy has been there and done that. Okay, he does not have to speak in the theoretical sense about the ugliness of Zionism. He has been there, he has seen it, he has heard it, he has smelled it, he has tasted it. All of the five senses, and even those we aren't even aware of possessing. He has experienced the ugliness of Jewish supremacism up close and personal. And therefore, anytime he offers his commentary on this very, very important topic, you can be rest assured that whatever it is he says, it is solid gold, and you can take it to the bank, folks. Take it to the bank. And the third entity that I want to thank is Press TV, because Press TV kindly, as a result of the interview that I did with one of their reporters, Kourosh Ziabari, they have opened up a new avenue for me to cause even more trouble, as if me being on their network and being interviewed on a semi-regular basis wasn't bad enough. Now they're going to allow me to write for them, folks. So they published the most recent article that I wrote dealing with Iran and the real nuclear program that Israel is worried about. The real Iranian bomb that has got Israel's knickers in a knot. It isn't a nuclear detonation other than in the sense that Iran will bring solidarity, cohesiveness, and order to a region that, if Israel is to survive, she cannot afford to have solidarity and cohesiveness and order in the region. She has to sow instability and chaos. She has to have people fighting and squabbling all around her in order for her to sit in the region as a queen, unopposed. So anyway, my thanks to Press TV for running that article. I'm rather proud of it myself, ladies and gentlemen. You won't hear me do that very often. Most of the time, my praise is extended to, first and foremost, my children and my friends. Very rarely will you hear me pat myself on the back, but nevertheless, not too shabby, Mr. Glenn. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, have a lot to discuss. I'm just going to go ahead and bring our Ute up tonight, and it is none other than Jonathan Azaziah of maskofzion.com. As I said, we're always honored to have Jonathan on the program. He is a razor blade amidst many, many butter knives, and that, unfortunately, encompasses the quality of many of the quote-unquote leaders and thinkers in this movement, folks. They're just butter knives, okay? And they don't even cut butter very well. Unfortunately, a lot of them, they just like to hear themselves talk. And they, as you know, they are afraid to take on the most taboo of all subjects. We're going to be talking about that tonight, as well as other things. I'm going to go ahead and bring up Jonathan Azaziah. As always, welcome to the program, and thank you for showing up.
Well, thank you, my dear brother, for having me on again. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that. Anyway, listen, there's a few news stories that I want to discuss before getting to the meat and potatoes of today's program. As you know, Jonathan, and as those of you who listen to this program know, my outrage button is easily pushed, meaning when I see things taking place out there that are just blatant, hypocritical. They're just blatantly hypocritical by their very nature. The fact that there is no fair playing field, the fact that the referee and the judges who are supposed to be impartial are not, I tend to complain about it. And there is no better representation of this unfairness and of this outrage than the way that Muslims are treated in this country. And for those of you new folks who are listening to the program today, I'm not a Muslim. I'm a Christian, okay? But that does not prevent or preclude me from being able to see that things are inherently unfair. They are inherently skewed against these people. And who are those responsible for doing the skewing? The very people that we have been lectured by for the last 50 years about how horrible racism is, how we're supposed to be tolerant of other people, and all the rest of that. And, of course, I'm talking about Jewish interests, the same Jewish interests that are jumping down the throats of people if something is said that is, quote-unquote, defamatory against Jewish interests. Well, they're screaming racism, they're screaming bigotry, they're screaming intolerance, but they don't do it when it's the Muslims. And see, you know why, folks, okay? How are you going to keep a nation of 300 million people like the United States at war with the enemies of these Jewish interests? How are you going to keep a nation like this at war against 1.5 billion people if they start to think rationally and they start to think fairly? Let's jump into our first example here of this outrage. Muslim worker forced to pray by dumpster and then fired. Listen to this, folks. Hold on, let's see. Hold on. Okay. A former employee at Whole Foods Market, 2001 Pennsylvania Avenue, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was allegedly subjected to pervasive harassment and retaliation once his supervisors found out about his Islamic faith. At one point, he was reportedly forced to pray by a trash dumpster after supervisors prevented him from performing prayers indoors in a storage room. Moreover, he was allegedly unfairly terminated on his return from Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca. Well, ladies and gentlemen, assuming that all of the information in this press release from CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations, assuming that it is all accurate, can you just imagine if instead of it being a Muslim who was forced to pray next to a dumpster and was eventually fired once it was learned that he was a Muslim, instead it had been someone from the Jewish persuasion who had been forced to pray next to a dumpster, and then afterwards he had been fired. Can you just... I'm not even going to finish the sentence, ladies and gentlemen. Okay? They would already be scripting for the made-for-TV movie that would be detailing this event. Probably Holocaust 2 or something like that. That's what they would name it. This is just one example. If you sign up for CAIR's email updates, you will hear about things like this happening every single day in this country. Okay? Now, do we hear these Jewish groups out there protesting against this? Where's the ADL? Where's the Southern Poverty Law Center? Okay? Whenever they get the slightest whiff of quote-unquote bigotry or intolerance when it comes to, let's say, for example, let's say that a daycare center has decided to not hire a particular worker because he happens to be gay, and they don't want to run the risk of having, statistically speaking, run the risk of having something happen to one of these children, which is very common, unfortunately. If you go and read through the police reports of children who are molested, okay, ADL and SPLC and some of these other groups would be all over that. Why aren't they protesting against what was done to this Muslim worker? Jonathan Azaziah, your thoughts on this?
Well, I don't know if you've seen the documentary called Defamation by the... Have you seen this documentary?
Yes.
If you remember in the beginning of the documentary, the Israeli filmmaker, Yoav Shamir, I believe is his name, he is speaking to an employee, and you have these employees documenting some of the cases of quote-unquote anti-Semitism that have come into their call centers over the last couple of weeks. And it is American Jews complaining that they couldn't get a day off. Okay? American Jews complaining that they couldn't get a day off. But this brother that you just described from the CAIR email blast is humiliated and then fired after they humiliated him. This is a real case of prejudice, a real case of bigotry, and a real case of Islamophobia. And there is no Zionist or Jewish group that cares for quote-unquote human rights to be found. And this reminds me of a personal story. I have a friend named Navid who is from an Afghan background, and he worked in Chase. And last year, my friend was fired from Chase because he decided to leave early on Friday to go to Jummah prayers, the Friday prayers in Islam. Navid made it very clear from the moment he was hired by this Chase Bank that he did have religious obligations to go to take care of every single Friday, and they said it was fine, but the manager that initially hired my friend was replaced with another, and when Naveed took off early on this Friday, he came back to have his desk emptied out, and he told he could no longer work there. And he still had friends within the bank because the majority of the workers were Muslim, which is quite typical. We know who run the banks, and their workers, of course, are always goyim. And there was a Jewish man who took my friend's place. And a couple months later, when it came for the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, apparently this Jewish man did not notify his superior that he had to take the day off. But when he came into work the following Monday, nothing happened. Mm-hmm. Not even a word was mentioned to him about taking a day off. So, ladies and gentlemen, my point is, the point of Mark's story and the point of my story is that if you are a Muslim in this country, the same rules do not apply to you. You are a second-class citizen. Your religion is considered second class. Your ethnic background is considered second class. And there is nobody that is going to stand up for you at all. And while we are all on the topic of care, just so I can make my position clear, and I don't know if you share the same opinion as me, but I view CARE as a organization with no fangs and no claws.
Right, I agree.
Because while they may point out situations like this, and rightfully so, and these situations should be brought to the American public's attention so they stop, if CARE was to get up on a milk crate and preach to thousands of people in city squares across this country about the ritualistic slaughter of Amalekites and Ishmaelites and Goyim all across the Islamic world, then their offices would be raided by the FBI. They would be deemed anti-Semitic, and they would never be able to operate again.
Exactly. Yes.
So the problem is, in my opinion, that even though these incidents of anti-Arab racism and anti-Muslim bigotry are continuing to rise, and organizations like CARE may bring them to light, they are still operating within the Zionist Jewish discourse, and because of that, Jewish power cannot be criticized, international Zionism cannot be criticized, and the Jewish serial wars, as you call them, my brother, cannot be mentioned whatsoever by any Islamic organization. Otherwise, the Zionist stereotype of raging Islamic fanatics will be reinforced, right. And I find that very sad. I
agree. I appreciate what CARE does in categorizing and cataloging these events. But other than that, it's like you said, Jonathan, it's like a Cadillac with no motor in it, okay? I mean, it's got extremely limited use at that point. And you're right. I mean, for an organization like this, I mean, it's like Patton said in the movie, or George C. Scott said in the movie where he played Patton. He said, no one ever won a war by dying for his country, okay? And what he was basically saying is there's no such thing as winning a war by taking the defensive. Okay, you have to take the offensive. And, nevertheless, I do appreciate the updates that they give. And on that note, we're going to go on to the next update that I have gotten from CARE. Tennessee legislator says remove all Muslims from military. A prominent national Muslim, blah, blah, blah. The Washington-based Council on American Islamic Relations said that Republican State Representative Rick Womack made these un-American remarks at an anti-Sharia conference yesterday, at which another speaker said American mosques should not have First Amendment protections and have no right to exist. In a video posted online, Womack said, "Personally, I don't trust one Muslim in our military. If they truly are a devout Muslim and follow the Quran," I mean, he doesn't even get his syntax or his agreement between subject and conjugated verb correctly. If they are truly a devout Muslim, how about if they are truly devout Muslims and follow the Quran and the Sunnah, then I feel threatened because they're commanded to kill me. When asked whether Muslims should be removed from the military, Womack answered, Absolutely, yeah. Well, once again, ladies and gentlemen, can you just imagine, in the aftermath of Israel's attack on the USS Liberty, in the aftermath of Israel's attempted blowing up of American buildings in Egypt in 1954 that came to be known as the Lavon Affair, in the aftermath of the Pollard spy scandal, which resulted in over 1,000 American intelligence assets being either captured or killed. Can you imagine, in the aftermath of Israel plotting to kill President George Herbert Walker Bush at the Madrid Peace Conference, as outlined by former Mossad agent Victor Ostrovsky in his book The Other Side of Deception? Can you imagine, in the aftermath of Israel's involvement in 9/11, where Israeli intelligence officers were seen cheering as the buildings were coming down? Can you imagine if anybody seeking office or holding office, even if it is down to the county dog catcher in Bonner County, Idaho, can you imagine them saying, Jews should be removed from the U.S. military, you cannot trust them, they follow a religion that teaches A, B, and C, and therefore they cannot be loyal Americans? Can you just imagine what would happen as a result of something like that? Jonathan Azaziah, your thoughts?
Well, I just find that absolutely hilarious, because I've read the Holy Quran at least 5 times back to back, and I read the Quran every single day. You know, it is my religion, and I know that you have also read the Holy Quran half a dozen times yourself, and there is not a single verse within the Holy Quran that commands me to kill anybody that isn't a Muslim. In fact, the majority of the people in this country are Christians, or I know we should use that term very loosely as of this point in history, but they would identify themselves as Christians, and throughout the Holy Quran there is nothing but the highest praise spoken of Jesus the Messiah alayhi salam and his holy virgin mother Miriam alayhi salam. And the most beautiful and most poetic verses describing Jesus, his life, his miracles, and his struggles against the Pharisees are described in the Holy Quran. And even the Jews are spoken of, a certain sect of the Jews are spoken of highly in the Holy Quran. So the idea that the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is commanding Muslims to go out and commit acts of aggression against non-Muslims is not only utterly ridiculous, but it's utterly incorrect. Mm-hmm. And it's, I guess we can call it a form of Jewish projection. Mm-hmm. Because we know who runs the media, who dominates the media. They've admitted, they have incessantly and consistently admitted that they run the media. And everyone that listens to this program is well aware of the Talmudic verse that says, it is permissible for a Jew to use subterfuge to circumvent a Gentile. Mm-hmm. And the reason why this is so important is because of the Jewish control of the media, that the very structure of the media is Talmudic, that lies are being used to circumvent the minds and interests of Gentiles, not only throughout America, but throughout the world. And while saying that Islam commands its followers to murder non-Muslims, in reality, it is the Talmud and the Kabbalah and even verses from the Old Testament itself that command its followers, which of course are Jews, to murder non-Jews, because non-Jews of course have souls that are not human. Mm-hmm. And their children are animals. Mm-hmm. And their women are filth and whores. Mm-hmm. And our prophets are sorcerers and sexual deviants and fools and servants of the rabbis themselves. Mm-hmm. So I just find it utterly disgusting, on top of embarrassing, really, for whoever put together such filthy, rotten propaganda that came out of this person's mouth, because the place where he should be looking is in his local yeshiva. That is the place that he should be scared of. not his local mosque.
Absolutely. You know, we have gone over this many times, Jonathan, on this program. And, of course, with the listeners to this program, you know, of course, we can count a certain amount of success with them. But as far as the rest of the country goes, the fact of the matter is that Americans in the Christian community are just, they're just dumber than dumb. I'm looking at another story here about this thing that they had in Nashville, this hate fest against Muslims. They also had another thing in Detroit, a prayer event sponsored by a group called The Call. Now, what they did was to get together. This is also the same group that sponsored the lunatic Pastor Terry Jones coming up and speaking about the dangers of Islam and all the rest of that. But I want you to just listen to this for a second, folks, okay? The reason that this group called The Call, a Christian group, the reason that they decided to have this thing, okay, is because they feel that the country is going down the tubes. Okay, we can certainly agree on that. They're complaining about the lack of morals, the lack of what we would call family values. And so, you know, they want to revitalize the Christian spirit of America. Okay? But listen to this. According to this story, this is an Associated Press story. The gathering at Ford Field, the stadium where the Detroit Lions play, is designed to tackle issues such as the economy, racial strife, same-sex relationships, and abortion. Okay? The organization known as The Call has said that Detroit is a, quote, microcosm of our national crisis in all areas, including the rising tide of the Islamic movement. Now, let's just back up here a second, folks. What are the four topics that they are dealing with here at this big love fest? The economy, racial strife, same-sex relationships, and abortion. Okay, and so they're going to use these hot-button topics as a means of getting together and pissing and moaning, pardon my French, particularly on this Sunday, getting together and pissing and moaning about Islam. What does Islam have to do with the economy being in the toilet? What does Islam have to do with the racial problems in America? What does it have to do with same-sex relationships or abortion? Nothing, folks. Zero. Okay? The economy is in the dumper right now, not because the Muslims own our banks and are running the economy. It's not because we have a Muslim sitting as the chairman of the Federal Reserve. It's not because the Muslims own upwards of 90% of all the brokerage houses in this country. Okay? Not the Muslims responsible for the American economy being in the toilet. Take out your dollar bill and turn it around to the backside where it's got the Great Seal of the United States. Okay? What is that thing sitting above the eagle? It's not a crescent. It's a Star of David, folks. So, item 1, the economy, racial strife. What does Islam have to do with the racial problems that we are facing in this country today? It's not the Muslims who are bringing drugs into black neighborhoods. It's not the Muslims who have opened up this country to immigration in the South that is causing illegal aliens to flow in here by the thousands every day. It's not the Muslims who are in control of the media and who are pumping all of this moral and intellectual filth into these impoverished minority communities, which we commonly refer to as ghettos. It's not the Muslims doing that. Who's doing that, folks? All right, same-sex relationships and abortion. Who's pushing the issue of same-sex relationships in this country? It's not the Muslims. I know I'm sounding redundant here, folks, but I need to make this point. It's not the Muslims pushing these things, folks. Okay? To the Islamic community, the idea of same-sex relationships is as abhorrent as it is within the quote-unquote conservative Christian community. Okay? And finally, abortion. Who was it who pushed through Roe versus Wade through our Supreme Court? Which Muslim organizations are the ones making sure that this act of child sacrifice, this demonic act of child sacrifice, takes place to the tune of about 4,000 or 5,000 a day, 7 days a week for the last 40 years? Wasn't the Muslims. It's absolutely abhorrent to them. But just as in the interview that I did with the lunatic Pastor Terry Jones, where I pointed out to him that all of these issues that he deals with, these social and moral issues, it's not the Muslims that are responsible for it, folks. Not the Muslims, but the Jews. Jonathan Azaziah, your thoughts?
Of course, there isn't a word that you just uttered that I don't agree with. And there really isn't too much that I can add to it, except Brother Keith called me, Brother Keith Johnson. He called me as he was at this Islamophobic filth festival in Tennessee.
I like that.
And
Filth festival.
And he called me because there was a very disgraceful sharmuta, and you should know what that means,
I do.
A disgraceful sharmuta there named Wafa Sultan.
Yes.
And this filthy creature, this disgraceful being, wrote a book called The God That Hates.
Mm-hmm.
And it was about how she lived in an Islamic country for her entire life, and how men were oppressive and women were treated horribly and non-Muslims were treated horribly. And the funny thing is, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, the Muslim country that she lived in was Syria.
Right.
And this is news to me and every other Arab in the Middle East, as well as in the diaspora, because Syria is not an Islamically governed country.
That's right.
Syria is a secular country.
Mm-hmm.
And as we have discussed in detail on this show, and as I have written about extensively on my website, maskofzion.com, the Christians within Syria, yes, brothers and sisters, there are actually Christians, millions of them that live in Syria, love Bashar al-Assad.
Yes.
And they feel safe with Bashar al-Assad. And they are frightened to death,
yes.
Literally to death,
yes,
of what may come after him. And that is the basis of what we are going to get into when we are done with these news stories, ladies and gentlemen. The Muslim Brotherhood, which is a perversion of Islam, is an organization that has stated on numerous occasions that it will murder Christians en masse if they reach power, mm-hmm. that they will drive the Christians out. And that is going to be the topic of what we are about to discuss in a moment. But my point is that Wafa Sultan claimed to live in this horrible, oppressive Islamic country. But Syria does not use Islam to govern its domestic policy. Mm-hmm. And when you look at Iran, which does use Islam, which does use Sharia, which is Islamic law, as the way of governing its country, Iran is the pinnacle of tolerance. It is the vertex of acceptance. As Muslims, Sunni and Shia alike, Christians and Jews live together in a harmonious, brotherly atmosphere. And that is because of Sharia. Mm-hmm. Whereas in countries like Saudi Arabia, which uses a perverted form of Islam, again, that we will touch on in just a moment, and Qatar and Bahrain and these other Gulf countries, they are brutal and horrible and oppressive and quite literally sanguinary, murderous dictatorships. You never see these nations being discussed in regards to human rights. So when you see an Arab get up on television to bash Islam and to bash Arab countries. Pull back the layer, ladies and gentlemen.
Mm-hmm.
Pull back the curtain. Because do you know who financed Wafa Sultan's speaking tour across the Middle East? Do you know who brought Wafa Sultan to the Knesset? The American Jewish Committee.
Mm-hmm.
The foreign policy wing of the Zionist lobby. And Brother Mark just mentioned Terry Jones, who wrote a utterly horrific book called Islam is of the Devil. Do you know who published Islam is of the Devil, ladies and gentlemen? A satanic company called Creation House. Creation House is a subsidiary of Strang Communications, owned by the lunatic Christian Zionist Stephen Strang, who is the director of operations in Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, and several other states in the Southeast for Christians United for Israel, which is the most powerful Goy organization standing with the Zionist entity in this country. So when you see Goyim speaking against Islam, whether they claim to be Muslim, whether they claim to be Christian, whether they are secular, whether they are atheists, always know that there is a Zionist behind it in one way or another. And the Islamophobic agenda is key. It is key. It is the integral element. It is the nucleus of continuing to wage Zionism's international serial wars on Islam until their plans of a Jewish utopia are complete.
Amen. Amen. One last story, Jonathan, before we jump into this shark-infested water here. Very interesting and very frightening story, ladies and gentlemen. Herman Cain. Herman Cain, up until a few weeks ago, was the front runner for the Republican nomination. He says that God persuaded him to run for president. Republican Herman Cain said that God convinced him to enter the race for president, comparing himself to Moses. "You've got the wrong man, Lord. Are you sure?" quote unquote. The Georgia business executive played up his faith Saturday after battling sexual harassment allegations for 2 weeks, trying to shift the conversation to religion, an issue vital to conservative Republicans, especially in the South. In a speech Saturday to a national meeting of young Republicans, Cain said the Lord persuaded him after much prayer. Quote, "That's when I prayed and prayed and prayed. I'm a man of faith. I had to do a lot of praying for this one, more praying than I've ever done before in my life," Cain said. "And when I finally realized that it was God saying, when I finally realized that it was God saying that this was what I needed to do, I was like Moses. You've got the wrong man, Lord. Are you sure?" Ladies and gentlemen, why is it whenever somebody says that they hear the voice of God talking to them, that not long afterwards people start dropping dead? Okay? Whether it's David Koresh, whether it is Jim Jones, whether it is Abraham and Moses as they are recounted in the Old Testament. Remember, Abraham is hearing the voice of God in his head, and the next thing you know, he's got a knife to the throat of his son, and he's about to chop his body up and burn him alive. Moses is hearing voices in his head that he thinks is God, and then the next thing you know, the Israelites have stolen all of the gold and silver from Egypt, and they are hightailing it into the promised land, quote unquote, so that they can begin the process of exterminating all of the people who live there. Now, can you imagine if somebody like yours truly, or Jonathan Azaziah, or someone else decided to run for office with the kinds of political opinions that we have, and we said that God told us to do it, that we heard the voice of God doing it? We would be laughed out of town. We would be called crazy. We would be called schizophrenic. All of the rest of that. Where is the voice of God telling Cain that killing millions of innocent people in the Middle East is wrong? Wasn't it God who said, "Thou shalt not kill"? if Cain is really what he claims to be, one of these conservative Christians, certainly, as we pointed out a few minutes ago, there are all sorts of things wrong with America. And it's no mystery how these situations came about and who is responsible for bringing them about. Why isn't the voice of God whispering into Cain's ear and telling him, Cain, it's not the Muslims responsible for causing all of this trouble. You see that guy over there, Dershowitz? See that guy over there, Foxman? See that gal over there, Pamela Geller? See that guy over there, Al Goldstein, who has flooded American culture with the most abominable filth that would probably even make the devil blush? So I find this interesting for that reason, that supposedly Cain's antenna can pick up the voice of God telling him that he's supposed to run for president, but God doesn't talk about anything else. Now, that's the first thing. The second thing, and I'm going to say this right to Mr. Cain himself. Mr. Cain, you were doing fine up until the point where you compared yourself to Moses, and here's the reason why. Your Jewish bosses don't consider you to be anything but a nigger. That's the fact of the matter. Whether they call you that, whether they use the N-word, whether they call you a Schwarzer, the fact of the matter is that the Jews and their religion hold on to certain ideas that put you in the position of an eternal slave. And they get this right out of their Old Testament, which I'm sure that you have read. The story of Noah and his sons Shem, Japheth, and Ham. And how Ham, because he saw his father's nakedness, Noah was drunk and passed out in his tent. Ham saw his nakedness and laughed at it. And because of that, Ham, and all quote-unquote biblical scholars agree on this, that Ham became the African nation, that they are consigned to be slaves to Shem forever, for all generations. It's because of the Jews and their religion that your ancestors were dragged from Africa to various parts around the world and made into slaves. So when you compared yourself to Moses in that regard, you may have thought that you were scoring some points with them, but all they did in the aftermath of that was to get together and to snicker and to say, can you believe what that nigger had to say? Jonathan Azaziah, your thoughts?
Well, of course, you again hit the nail right on the head. And I think that this is an issue that is not talked about enough by our own movement. The transatlantic slave trade was Jewish run. It was Jewish dominated. It was Jewish inspired. And they had a purpose for fomenting and profiting from the transatlantic slave trade and the 100 million Africans that were slaughtered in the process of it. And that is because, as we have mentioned many times on this show, the Jewish community does not play checkers, ladies and gentlemen. They play chess. And they plan things out, not decades, but centuries in advance, as their Old Testament and their Talmud and their Kabbalah will tell you and show you. And the clash of civilizations that we are seeing now between the West and the Islamic Eastern world, it began with the transatlantic slave trade, ladies and gentlemen. Because a little known fact that most of you have probably never heard is that more than half the slaves that were brought to this country were Muslims. They were stripped of their Islamic names, they were stripped of their Islamic culture, and they were stripped of their Islamic religion, so it can be replaced with slave names, whether the slave owner was an Anglo-Goy or a Spanish or German Jew. Their names were replaced to reinforce the idea of servitude to Jews and to their Shabbos Goyim. And they were then fed the Old Testament as their new religion. So they knew wholeheartedly who their masters were and what place they had in this world. So when you look at Herman Cain and you see where he is now, the only reason why he is even on this stage is because there are powerful Zionist interests behind him. I feel, brother, that people have forgotten, because of the occasional jabs that are thrown at Obama and the Zionist media to keep the Kabbalistic right-left dichotomy false narrative going in the minds of the American people, that on Obama's come-up he was referred to as the first Jewish president. Mm-hmm. And that the powerful Jewish political network in Chicago of ex-gangsters, or rather still gangsters, and they just put an X in front of it, brought him to power and nurtured him as if he was their golem. Mm-hmm. So when you see a black man in a position of power in this country, just as we mentioned just a few moments ago, when you see Goyim bashing Islam, there is a Zionist Jew behind them. Mm-hmm. The same thing goes for a black man being in power. Because let me explain to you, ladies and gentlemen, what happens to black men in this country who stand up to the Zionist agenda and Jewish interests. Let us start with Marcus Garvey, Allah yarhamu, who was utterly destroyed by the Zionist judge Julian Mack, imprisoned for 5 years, and his dream of Pan-African unity was demolished. The NAACP, which we constantly hear as the voice of African Americans in this country, do you know who it was created by? A man named Henry Moskowitz, mm-hmm. who was a prominent Zionist that had directorship in the ADL and the American Jewish Congress. He created the NAACP to stifle men, just like the righteous and honorable Marcus Garvey. Malcolm X, Allah yarhamu ya Rab. We never hear about Malcolm X, ever. You want to know why? Because he gave a famous speech in Cairo to the great Egyptian leader Jamal Abdel Nasser, may he rest in peace. And he said that Zionists have mastered a science called dollarism, and that there is no legal or historical or intelligent basis for the Zionist land theft and occupation of Palestine. Malcolm X was assassinated. Even Martin Luther King, who was manipulated by the American Jewish Committee and the ADL, and whose handler was a Jewish communist named Stanley Levison, when he decided to find his testicular fortitude and stand up to the same interests that brought him to power, he was assassinated. Mm-hmm. And in the modern era, when we saw Earl Hilliard, the congressman from Alabama, when he stood up for Muammar al-Qaddafi, may he rest in peace, he was destroyed by the Zionist lobby. And the same thing goes for Cynthia McKinney, maybe the only righteous congresswoman that we've had in the last decade or so. She was destroyed by the Zionist lobby and later on thrown in prison in an Israeli dungeon when she made a trip to the illegally besieged strip in Gaza. So when you see black faces on the screen, just know that that is all that it is, ladies and gentlemen. It is blackface, just like the blackface theater of more than 80 years ago. Mm-hmm. If you are an African leader in this country and you stand up for real peace and justice, i.e. standing against international Zionism and Jewish power, then you will be slandered and you will be smeared.
Yes.
And that is the end of the story.
Yep, absolutely. And I can't add anything to that, Jonathan. So let's move on to the meat of the discussion. People are probably thinking, this is just the warm-up act. Well, these were important things we needed to talk about, folks. But what we really had planned to discuss was an issue that does not get really any discussion within the alternative media or really anywhere else that I have been able to locate. So I guess in that regard, I'm honored that we are going to be one of the few forums that's going to be hosting a discussion of this sort. And Actually, I'm just going to go ahead and pass the microphone over to my better half here and let him kind of lead you through the maze, as it were, folks, because he's much more up on this topic than I am. So, Jonathan Azaziah, take it away.
Yes, sir. No problem. Over the last year, ladies and gentlemen, we have seen massive changes, or so we are told, in the Middle East and Islamic world. We have seen uprisings take place in half a dozen countries, and we have seen forces in motion in an amalgamation that we have never seen out in the open before. Because the fact remains, ladies and gentlemen, is that there has been no massive change in the Middle East. We have seen corrupt rulers replaced with even more corrupt, more subservient rulers, and all the while that little Talmudic enclave, that little usurping dragon regime hosted on holy Arab land in Palestine, is licking its chops and twiddling its thumbs in enjoyment and glee because all of their plans are coming to fruition. We mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood just a moment ago, and without giving you a 3.5-hour lecture on what the Muslim Brotherhood really is, the long and short of it is, the Muslim Brotherhood was brought to prominence by a man named Sayyid Qutb, who was an Egyptian scholar of the highest order, and a righteous man that is loved and appreciated all across the Islamic world, Sunni, Shia, Sufi, alike. And Sayyid Qutb founded the Muslim Brotherhood because he wanted to fight Zionism, and he wanted to fight Western materialism that he viewed as the greatest threat to the Islamic world. And he wanted to fight colonialism. Well, if Sayyid Qutb was around today, he would have either put a bullet in his head in frustration or simply secluded himself in disgust because he wouldn't be able to deal with it. But since this great soul, Allah yarhamu wa radiyallahu anhu, is not here, I can assure you that the great scholar is turning over in his grave as to what the Muslim Brotherhood has become today. In Syria, as we have discussed on this show and as I have written in 4 articles, the first of which was a 2-parter named Kiss of Democratic Death, Israel's Plot to Take Down Syria. The second was called Syria Zionist Mobilization Kicks into High Gear. And the third, or rather the fourth, as the first was a 2-parter, was Syria Zionist destabilization reaches critical mass or hits critical mass. The Muslim Brotherhood in Syria has been used as a bloody tool for Israel, for America, and yes, for the House of Saud, for Saudi Arabia, which for all of its bluster and for all of its talk has been the Zionist entity's ally for the last 60 years. And in Tunisia, where a spontaneous uprising began, and then the NED-NDI elements hijacked it and crushed the anti-Zionist elements of this uprising, we have now seen an organization called Al-Nahda come to power and quote-unquote win an election there. But brothers and sisters, do you know who is funding Al-Nahda? It is none other than Qatar. The same monarchy that has offered the Zionist regime unlimited amounts of natural gas. The same monarchy that rolled out the red carpet for Zippy Livni and Shimon Peres at its financial forums over the last 2 years. In Egypt, We have seen the Muslim Brotherhood, where it was birthed by Sayyid Qutb, draw closer to the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, known here on out as SCAF, and open up channels to none other than the House of Saud, the royal family, the royal ruling family of the fabricated nation state known as Saudi Arabia. And lastly, in Libya, we are seeing a group of people who identify themselves as Islamic with the Libyan Muslim Brotherhood and other Libyan quote-unquote Muslim fundamentalist organizations sitting at the head from Derna and from Ras Lanuf, who have taken power in Libya in the post-Qaddafi era. So what does all of this mean? What it all means, ladies and gentlemen, is that we are witnessing the final stage of the reshaping of the Middle East. Because the one uprising in the Middle East that has gotten no attention and no coverage whatsoever is the uprising in the little island nation state of Bahrain. These people rose up and their demands were simple. The Al Khalifa family, the ruling family there that is closely allied both by blood and by ideology to the House of Saud. They wanted this family removed after ruling them not for 30 years as you hear in the Western media, the Western Zionist media, but for more than 200 years this royal family has ruled there. They asked for its removal. They asked for the Fifth Fleet, which the Zionist-occupied United States government uses to pressure Iran. They wanted it removed, and they wanted all ties removed with the Zionist regime. This uprising was crushed by an organization known as the Peninsula Mission Force. The Peninsula Mission Force is the military power of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. I know many of you have never heard of this group. The reason why it is important for you to understand what took place in Bahrain is because the House of Saud signed an agreement with the Zionist-dominated U.S. State Department that said, we will give you support for you to wage your war in Libya if you allow us to crush this uprising in Bahrain. Over the last several months, brothers and sisters, we have seen military ties increase between the American government and the GCC. We have seen America make its biggest arms deal in history, signing $60 billion worth of weapons to the House of Saud. Do you know who this arms deal was approved by? It was Israel. If the House of Saud posed such a threat to the Zionist regime, why would they sign off on such a massive weapons deal? We have watched Germany sell 200 Leopard-class battle tanks to Saudi Arabia within the last couple of months. We have seen America sell $200 million worth of arms to Bahrain and increase military and intelligence ties to Bahrain. And in maybe the most damning piece of evidence that we can mention, just 2 days ago, 1,000, do you hear me, brothers and sisters? 1,000 bunker buster bombs were transferred to the little nation of the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. Only months after inviting Blackwater, the Zionist-dominated mercenary murder force that ravaged Iraq and Afghanistan to train their troops and create a new crowd control unit of the military. The GCC, brothers and sisters, was founded in 1981, only 2 years after the Islamic Revolution came to power in Iran. And the reason why it was established was to counter the Islamic Revolution, because these Gulf nations did not want the revolutionary ideology of Ayatollah Sayyid Khomeini radiallahu anhu spreading to their nations, because it would inspire them to rise up and overthrow these monarchies in a similar manner that the Islamic Revolution did. So the GCC was essentially doing the dirty work for America in Israel in the beginning, but now it is a full-fledged partner, because the war in Libya, as we have discussed numerous times on this show, including just recently with our good friend and my close personal friend Martin Iqbal, in Libya we watch the nation of Qatar provide oil marketing strategies, banking marketing strategies, weapons, fighter jets, and attack strategies for the Libyan rebels, which were nothing more than conduits for NATO and the Zionist entity. We saw Qatar admit that they had 5,000 soldiers on the ground directing these rebels, because it was easier for them to blend in than Western forces. And in Syria, we are watching the House of Saud play a dangerous, dangerous role. They have created an entire division of their defense ministry to fuel civil war in Syria. So is it simply a matter that the GCC, America and Israel, are united against the Islamic Republic of Iran and Pakistan by default, because the Pakistani government has been getting very close to the Islamic Republic of Iran over the last decade. We have now watched the House of Saud attempt to counter these measures by buying Pakistan off. The House of Saud has said, we will give you all the money you need to repair your economy. We just want you to use your security firms to help us keep the uprising in Bahrain at bay. So this is not only to counter Iran, but the Iran, Pakistan, Kashmir, Syria axis. And they are doing so not because, brothers and sisters, they are a mere conduit for the Zionist entity and its Shabas Goyim and the American and British governments. It is because they possess an ideological and even racial link to the powerful Jewish interests that now control, occupy Palestine. Because the ideology that governs these people is a perversion of Islam called Wahabism, that popped up more than 200 years ago with a man named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. And Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was guided in his journey to attain power in Saudi Arabia by none other than British intelligence. And we know that British intelligence and Britain as a whole has been controlled by the Rothschild banking family since 1694. So anything that Britain does, it is doing it at the behest of the City of London, which is essentially Rothschild headquarters.
Let's back up just a second here, Jonathan, because I want the listeners here to grasp a few of the subtleties that you covered in just in the introduction to this thing.
Yes.
This is very important, folks, because you know what we have said on this program many times now over the course of the last year, that for the most part, these revolutions, quote unquote, that are taking place in the Middle East are fake. And one of the criteria that we have used in proving this case is when you look at where the revolutions have succeeded and where they have not succeeded. Okay, you'll remember that the cry going out in the early minutes after some of these revolutions began was, oh, the United States has lost control of it. They can't control it anymore. The people have had it, and they're rising up. And the United States and Israel, they're panicked over this, terrified who's going to take over in Tunisia, who's going to take over in Egypt. Well, no, this was not the case, folks. This was not the case at all. The proof of it is the fact that in Bahrain, where, as Jonathan pointed out, the United States has a huge military base for its Fifth Fleet. Okay, you don't see revolutions, the revolution in Bahrain succeeding. Why? Because the United States and Israel don't want it to succeed at this particular moment. Okay, at this particular moment. You don't see any revolutions taking place in Saudi Arabia. You don't see any revolutions taking place in Jordan. Okay, because the United States is making sure that none of these revolutions take place there. They are either making sure that they do not put their agitators on the ground, as they are in Syria, as they are in Iran, as they were and are in Egypt and in Libya. Okay, they either are making sure that their agitators and operatives are not on the ground there, or else they're making sure that the governments that they want to keep propped up, such as in Saudi Arabia, such as in Bahrain, such as in Jordan, that they have all of the necessary intel and money and military equipment and training and everything else in order to put down these revolutions. Okay, Jonathan, go ahead and take it from there.
Yes, this is an extremely important point. Because, and I'm glad that you've brought up Jordan, because Jordan, ladies and gentlemen, has just joined the GCC. And it is well known that the Jordanian military is one of the most well-trained in the entire region. They were trained by British and French intelligence, and they have now just been added to the Peninsula Mission Force. And it is essential to note that Morocco, Al-Maghreb, was just also inducted into the GCC. The reason why this is important is because one of the greatest traitors that the Islamic world has ever known, King Hassan II of Morocco, he is known in the Arab world because he integrated Moroccan intelligence with Mossad. Moroccan intelligence and Mossad are interchangeable terms, ladies and gentlemen. So inducting Morocco into the GCC and having Moroccan intelligence provide intel to the GCC means that Mossad is providing intelligence to the GCC. It's also important to note that just 2 years ago, again remember folks that the Zionist entity and its rabbinical overlords, they do not play checkers, they play chess. Everything they do is planned in advance. Just 2 years ago, the Kingdom of Morocco cut off ties with the Islamic Republic of Iran completely. That set the stage for it to join this anti-Iran mission force, the GCC. So now what you have, brothers and sisters, is a military force of millions of what? Muslims. Millions of Muslims ready to go to war with Iran, which is a Muslim country. So what is the Zionist objective? To have Arabs destroy Persians, Persians destroy Arabs, Shia destroy Sunni, and Sunni destroy Shia, leaving everybody destroyed, leaving the Islamic religion in shambles, so they can pick up their pieces and erect their Jewish utopia. But, again, it is important that the leaders of the House of Saud, and the leaders of Bahrain, and the leaders of Qatar, they have an ideological bond with Israel, and for the House of Saud, they have a racial bond with Israel. The religion of Wahabism, and that is really what it is a separate religion, and Shia and Sunni alike consider it a perversion of Islam, was created by a man, as I had mentioned, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who was guided by British intelligence, a mercenary force for the Rothschild banking family, to establish this religion, to begin the groundwork of weakening Islam. Because as it is revealed in Surat Al-Hijr, the 15th chapter of the Holy Quran, verse 9, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that we shall preserve this book, meaning the Quran will always be protected. And there has not been a vowel, ladies and gentlemen, not a vowel, not a punctuation mark, changed in the Holy Quran for 1400 years. So since the Zionist regime has been unable to get people away from Islam by bombing countries back to the Stone Age, they haven't been able to get people away from Islam with their decades-long campaign of Islamophobia, funded with billions of Zionist Jewish dollars. They are now attempting a more subversive method, and that is to install Wahhabi regimes all across the Middle East. In Libya, as we see now, in Tunisia, as we see now, in Egypt, we see that the Muslim Brotherhood will take power in parliament as soon as there is an election. In Syria, they are attempting to do it. In Lebanon, they want to destroy the righteous Lebanese Islamic resistance, get rid of it and replace it with a Wahhabi regime. So they can install Wahhabi practice and strip the resistance of Islam. As my good friend and Mark's good friend, our brother Nasheed Abdul Khalik told me on the phone the other day, they want to rip out the kernel of Islam and simply leave the shell. And why is that, ladies and gentlemen? Because the doctrine of Wahhabism is intolerance. It is well known that anyone that did not adhere to Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab's ideology in the opening days of the advent of Wahhabism was put to death, was mass murdered, especially the Shia, establishing the groundwork for the great Sunni-Shia divide to be manipulated 100 years later by the Zionist entity. Who does that sound like, brothers and sisters? Because this is not an Islamic teaching. For Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who considered himself a sheikh, a religious leader, to put people to death for not adhering to his rulings, to not adhering to his legal interpretations, to not adhering to his way of doing things, is not Islamic in nature, brothers and sisters. It is Talmudic in nature. Because as it is known, there are dozens of verses in the Babylonian Talmud that put to death not only Goyim, but put to death Jews who do not obey the commandments of the rabbinate. Why would Talmudic ideology find its way into Islam? Something that is diametrically and wholeheartedly opposed to Judaism and the Talmud and the Kabbalah? Because Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab himself, ladies and gentlemen, was a descendant of a Donmeh Jewish family. And if you have never heard the term Donmeh before, then I suggest that you go to your favorite internet search engine and you put in Donmeh and Young Turks. Because the Young Turks that toppled the Ottoman Empire were not only closely linked to the mass murder of Vladimir Jabotinsky, the Zionists who developed the Iron Wall ideology, but they were Jewish in origin. And the Donmeh Jews, ladies and gentlemen, were the followers of the sexual deviant, the pervert, the great liar, Shabbatai Zevi, the false messiah of the 1600s, and later his successor, Jacob Frank. The Donmeh Jews were congregated in Salonika in Turkey. And they then made their way to Saudi Arabia. And they found kinship with MI6. Because as it is known, MI6 is a deeply Kabbalistic organization. And the Kabbalah was the basis of all of the teachings of Shabbatai Zevi. So, whether Muslims know it or not, and this is a wake-up call to all of my Muslim brothers and sisters who have been manipulated into believing this Wahhabi ideology, whether you know it or not, you are following Talmudic and Kabbalistic teachings developed by Donmeh Freemasonic Jews, and they have simply put an Islamic mask on it. You have been duped, brothers and sisters. You have been severely duped.
So, Jonathan, let's bring this into context here.
Yes.
You know, as we pointed out at the beginning of the program, you've got a well-funded, well-trained, well-oiled machinery that is out there warning the dangers of violent, radical, intolerant Islam, and then at the same time, you have the same groups who are pushing for this type of violent, intolerant, insane Islam in places such as Saudi Arabia. So, in effect, what they're doing, you know, they can only maintain this magic spell over people if they can point to something that appears to be provable from time to time. And so,
yes,
by cultivating this violent jihadist mindset in places such as Saudi Arabia, it makes the story all the more believable later when something goes boom and they can pin it on Muslims. And then also, as you pointed out, this is very important. What they're doing, in effect, is that they are creating a giant Islamic army. That, let's face it, it's not that difficult to figure out what is going to be done with this army. As you pointed out, they are going to be used to destroy and occupy Iran, to destroy and occupy Syria, probably Pakistan.
Yes.
So this is the end goal for them creating something like this, is again to have the Muslims do the dirty work of destroying themselves for Zionist interests.
Yes, exactly, mashallah. And this is an extremely important point that Brother Mark has made, because throughout the world, when you hear of Muslims doing horrible things, it doesn't matter whether it is true or whether it is untrue. The point is that Saudi Arabia itself, the House of Saud, can trace its origins back to the same Donmeh Jews that Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab comes from. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab's patron, Amir Saud, let's call him the grandsire of today's Saudi royal family. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, again, I would like you to go to your favorite internet search engine yourself. Monarchy is forbidden in Islam. Just to make that very clear. There is a verse in the Quran that states explicitly that monarchy is forbidden. So the very fact that these monarchies exist on holy Islamic lands are a perversion of Islam. So these monarchies claim to be preaching Islam while violating Islam. This, again, is not an Islamic practice. This is a Judaic practice, because as we know, Judaism is very self-deceptive. Very self-deceptive. The rabbis have installed escape clauses and decoy texts, not only to trick the goyim who attempt to investigate it, but to trick the Jews who have no, I would say, interest in studying the intricacies of the Jewish religion, so it makes it easier for the rabbis to control your regular, everyday, run-of-the-mill Jew. So this self-deception that is engraved in Judaism has now been exported to Islamic countries via the ideology of Wahhabism. And everywhere you look of Muslims doing bad things, quote-unquote, you always find the House of Saud there. So what Saudi Arabia and Qatar and these other Wahhabi nations are effectively doing is they are perpetuating the idea that Islam is bad. So the Judaic crusade against Islam can continue to go on until Islam and all resistance nations are destroyed. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And as we mentioned earlier, the Christians in Syria are petrified. They are completely petrified. As Brother Mark has discussed in several appearances on Russia Today and Press TV, the unrest that is going on in Egypt between Christians and Muslims, this is something that comes right out of the Oded Yanon playbook, and it is being manipulated by Zionist interests via who? The Wahhabis. Wahhabis are calling out Christians and slandering Christians and attacking Christians, so again, Islam can look bad while preparing Egypt for the reoccupation of the Sinai. So we are witnessing an undeniable nexus of Zionism and Wahhabism. And brothers and sisters, while we Shia, as most of you know, I come from an Iraqi Shia family from Kufa. And my brothers and sisters who are Sunni, we have gotten past the rift and the division. Because whatever our spiritual differences may be, at the end of the day, an American occupier that is doing the dirty work for Israel and Iraq or Afghanistan does not ask you whether you are Sunni or Shia before he puts a bullet in the head of your family. When NATO drops a bomb on Libya, he is not asking if the mosque is Sunni or Shia before he pulls the trigger. And the same thing goes for this plan that is in place to pit millions of Sunni Muslims in the GCC Peninsula Mission Force against tens of millions of Shia Muslims in Iran. They do not care about us. And they do not care about sectarian differences. It is only a matter of one of their tools, one of their tentacles. It is simply the avenue that they are using to further their agenda, because at the end of the day, we are all goyim to them. And if we do not wake up, brothers and sisters, we are going to turn on our televisions or turn on our laptops or click open our phones one day and know that the multi-sectarian nation of Pakistan, that the Shia nation of Iran, and the Sunni Arab forces of the GCC are going to war. And do you know who is going to be licking their chops again? The Jewish supremacists that govern the Zionist entity, the Jewish supremacists that govern the city of London, and the Jewish supremacists that sit atop the hill in Washington, D.C. And the blood of Muslims will turn the oceans of the world red. It is up to us right now to root out this Wahhabi beast, which is nothing more than another manifestation of Judaism. And it is up to us to unite, no matter if you are Sunni, if you are Shia, if you are Sufi, whatever your sect is, it just does not matter anymore. We must unite against this Zionist demon before the entire world goes ablaze. And the children of Mark, and the children that I hope to soon have, and the children and grandchildren that some of you may already have, will witness a world that never, never will be the same.
Well, on that note, what can I say except for, wow, Jonathan, every time I think I'm just about to get a handle on the Middle East situation and to be able to comfortably say I understand pretty well what's going on, I sit down and get a college-level education from you, and then realize that I've got a hell of a long way to go before I can sit comfortably and say that I understand the situation very well. So, wow, what can I say except for wow? That's just about it. What else? And keep in mind that we're going to have to close shop up here in about 5 minutes. But how do we, let's put it this way. You know, we started off the program talking about how we have these very well-funded, powerful interest groups who are holding these rallies in places like in Tennessee and other places, warning about the dangers of the Muslims, and all the while you have these Jewish interests who are funding these quote-unquote Islamic groups in order to make the narrative believable. How do we rationally and intelligently counter this when we're sitting down with our neighbor or one of our relatives and we're saying, no, here's the way that it is. You've got these groups who are funding the creation of these, well, no different, I suppose, Jonathan, than on the Christian side. You have these Jewish interests who are funding nutcases like John Hagee and others in order to, while they're using the Christian Zionists, of course, to keep the wars going in the Middle East for Israel's sake, they also want to set the stage for later using everything that these Christian Zionist groups did as prima facie evidence that they're dangerous and that they have to be destroyed as well. You see what I'm saying?
Yes, absolutely. This is exactly the point, that the real Christians, as we would call them, or as our good friend and brother Chuck Carlson would say, the followers of Christ, alayhi salam, like you, like brother Chuck, like brother Keith, like brother Mark Dankoff, Christians of your extraction have been lost in the shuffle because of the Zionist funding and the Zionist propping up of Christian Zionism. It is you who suffer as real Christians. And the same thing goes for us as real Muslims. Whether you're Shia or whether you're Sunni, again, it does not matter anymore. As real Muslims, it is us who are suffering because of literally Jewish interests that are funding these extremist groups. We can call them extremist groups because that's exactly what they are. So the best way, I would say, to fight it is to do exactly what we are doing here, which is taking the time to rationally and intelligently and systematically break down the history to people. Because as we know, Brother Mark, Islam to Muslims did not pop up 1400 years ago. Islam to us has been around for thousands of years, beginning even before the creation of Prophet Adam alayhi salam. We believe that Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was around as a particle of light that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was simply waiting to release into the world to guide us all from the darkness that we are now facing today. And this light finally did manifest with Jesus alayhi salam, with Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and with the real Moses alayhi salam and several of the other real Israelite prophets that are described in the Holy Quran in their righteous, God-fearing, truthful identity. And for us to have a real discussion, we have to be able to articulate that Islam has been around for this amount of time, whereas Wahhabism has only been around for the last 200 years or so. And the same thing goes for Christian Zionism, which has only been around for the last 100 years or so. And that these groups are hijacking our religion in the name of a third party, in the name of this usurping Zionist dragon in Palestine. And Muslims are scared. They are scared down to the bone to speak about it because of the kind of power that Saudi Arabia wields, not only in the Middle East, but right here. And once you know the origins of the House of Saud, knowing that they do come from a Jewish background, it makes much more sense as to why America is so close to the House of Saud, why the Zionist regime is so close to the House of Saud. And once this is known, we can then begin to build an alliance. And I think that that is something that we need to look into in the future and discuss with our brothers and sisters and discuss with our closest friends about forming solidarity groups, not these fake leftist solidarity groups with Palestine that are accomplishing nothing, but taking back our religion from the Zionists who claim to speak in our name. And again, the sooner we do it, the better. Because as we are seeing in Syria, Bashar al-Assad, his army and his people are literally fighting for their lives against this demon. In Libya, we have already seen Muammar al-Qaddafi brutally murdered and this new puppet Wahhabi regime erected there. And Tunisia and Egypt, they are in the throes in Bahrain, we must keep our eyes on Bahrain over the coming months, as in Pakistan as well. Because the rise of Wahhabism, ladies and gentlemen, is the rise of Judaism in the Islamic world. And you may wake up 100 years from now and you turn to your holy Quran and you hear a knock on the door from the religious police. Yes, there is an entity in Saudi Arabia called the religious police that police anyone that is quote-unquote deviating. Imagine the Orwellianism of this, deviating from a deviation, deviating from the teachings of Wahhabism, and your holy Quran is confiscated from you. This is the kind of world that awaits us, and our only weapon against it. For we do not have the money of the Rothschilds, and we do not have the money of the Jewish house of Saud. We simply have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala standing on our side, and the sword that He has put in our hands, metaphorically speaking, our tongues, is the truth. If we speak the truth, then the lies will crumble. Just like the loosely put together narrative that it is.
Fascinating. Jonathan, I cannot thank you enough, as always, for coming on the program and adding that much-needed spice to the soup to give it its life-saving properties. So if you would please just hold on a quick second. I am going to close out the program, but I want to talk to you off the air.
Yes, sir.
There you go, ladies and gentlemen. You heard it here on this Sunday, November the 13th, 2011 edition of the Ugly Truth Podcast. Wow, folks, like I am fond of saying on this program, I knew it was going to be good. I didn't know it was going to be that good, but then what more would you expect with someone like Brother Jonathan Azaziah? Truly, ladies and gentlemen, he is a lion, and we are very lucky to have him. Anyway, make sure to visit his website at maskofzion.com. Drop him a line, let him know how much you appreciate all the hard work that he puts into all of this, and as obvious, ladies and gentlemen, if you listened even to a smidgen of what he said today, he puts a lot of work into it. I shudder to think what kind of power is sitting under the hood upstairs in that brain of his. Anyway, that's it for today, folks.